Historian and biographer Roy Foster will host Beautiful Lofty Things, an evening with W.B.Yeats in the National Concert Hall this Saturday, a Poetry Ireland event for Yeats 2015. The event will feature performances by John Banville, Aoife Duffin, Lisa Dwan, Martin Hayes and Iarla O'Linnord, amongst others. Roy, you say you're going to explore more surprising aspects of Yeats's life and work in this event. What aspects in particular are you thinking of?
Well, Yeats is always surprising, partly because of what I suppose you'd call poetic prescience. You know, he is so much of the moment, even 150 years after his birth. But I suppose by emphasising that, there will be the sort of canonical Celtic Twilight things, though not the Lake Isle of Innisfree. But we're also going to look at his later disillusionments with life, his interest in the occult, his complicated love life, his attitudes to sex and censorship, and, if you like, the social critique that sometimes surprisingly comes through this poet who's so often thought to be otherworldly and Celtic Twilighty.
Well, that Celtic Twilight period, what kind of Ireland was he presenting, and why do those poems have such an enduring appeal?
Well, partly simply because of the wonderfully rhythmic, exotic, rather narcotic language in them, and the terrific way that he uses, for instance, Irish place names to conjure up a very vivid and ethereal idea of Irish landscape and Irish, the Irish supernatural as well. They also, of course, are very much of their time. They're of the 1890s, when poets indeed in other countries and other languages were experimenting in a not dissimilar way. But they came to prominence, as he came to prominence, at a time, of course, when national cultural revival was also a kind of mounting tide, which he both rode and to a certain extent directed as well.
You've mentioned that he went through various periods. His view of Ireland changed over his lifetime, and was there a sense that he became disillusioned with the new republic?
Well, I think he went through various stages of disillusionment. He was disillusioned with materialist bourgeois Ireland before the revolution, and great poems like September 1913, which will be read on Saturday night. And then his politics changed during the revolution, which is something we'll be looking at. But then, yes, in the late 20s and 30s, he becomes deeply disillusioned with censorship, again, the materialism of the new Ireland, and the power of the Catholic Church, which he spoke out very strongly against, which, since he was himself of a Protestant background, was considered, I think, a rather tasteless thing to do.
You can't talk about Yeats without talking about Maud Gonne, to whom he proposed 4 times and was 4 times rejected. However, as she very astutely noted, the world should thank me for not marrying you. How did his view of her and of love change and evolve over the years?
In love, he was a rather late developer, partly inhibited by his love for her, which got in the way of affairs with other people. Again, something we'll be looking at, a lovely poem, After Long Silence, which is about exactly that, really. His relationship with Gonne in some ways doesn't change because they remain such friends, even though they disagree violently over politics and have fallings out. Their friendship is extraordinarily enduring, which is a thing that is very characteristic of Yeats. He remains friends with the women with whom he has had love affairs, and many of his best friends are women, notably Augusta Gregory. That was not a romantic relationship, but it was, I think, probably the deepest friendship of his life. And his poems about women are, I think, marvellous. They also reflect his feelings about sex and sexual repression, and again about the pieties and Puritanism of Irish life, and notably in the Crazy Jane poems, which Aoife Duffin will be reading one of on Saturday night.
You said that his relationship to Maud Gonne got in the way of his affairs with other women. His marriage to George doesn't seem to have got in the way of having affairs with other women.
Well, his marriage to George, which rescued him at a very bitter and difficult and neurotic time of his life, was a great success. In his latter years, in the 1930s, he did have affairs with other women, uh, but with her, I think, amused tolerance in many ways. And I think the strength and endurance of the bond between them is very strong indeed.
You mentioned that September 1913 and After Long Silence will be read at Saturday's event. How did you go about choosing the poems to be read as part of this, and did you allow the writers and performers much latitude in choosing what to do?
Very little. No, we were Maureen Kennelly of Poetry Ireland, Lynn Parker, who's directing it, and myself thought very carefully about who would read what. And for readers, we have a mixture of poets, because I think that's very, very important. We have great poets, Ivan Boland and John Montague reading. We have novelists, John Banville and Sebastian Barry. They all are distinctive also for having very fine voices and for being very good readers. I've heard them all read their own work. We also chose a number of actors. Lisa Dwan, whom I've heard read Yeats at a reading I did in London, one of the Josephine Hart poetry hours. Aoife Duffin, whom I had read Yeats at a Yeats reading I organised at the Boris Festival. Marty Ray, who's a very fine actor, again with a wonderful voice. So we, I think, got a terrific first team. As to choosing the poems, I think the idea was to reflect in a roughly, though not entirely chronological way, the shifting interests and also the enduring themes of Yeats's life from the beginning to the end. And we end with his very last poems, written practically on his deathbed, though ironically we begin with a late poem too. So it's carefully structured, and I think it flows through his life and through the recurring themes of his life. And I hope that his own words, read by this very distinguished collection of people, will reflect that too. We also have a lot of music from marvellous musicians, from Irlo Linnard, who will also read, from Bill Whelan, from Martin Hayes, and Michelle O'Rourke will sing. So I think the music will be a highlight of the evening.
I was going to ask you about that. Bill Whelan is going to be playing some of his own songs along with Cormac DeBarra on harp and Flo McSweeney, singer Flo McSweeney. What material has he written new stuff for this evening?
He has written settings of Yeats, which I think he's been working on before this evening, but we're certainly very much done with this evening in mind, including The Dead Lips Sing from one of Yeats's plays, and Queen Edain's Song, again from a play from Deirdre.
And do you feel that Yeats needs to be read aloud to be fully appreciated?
Yes, I do. And one thing we're doing in this evening, we're going to use some poems that are often thought to be difficult, like A Bronze Head, an extraordinary, very late poem about Maud Gonne, but which when read somehow makes sense in a way that reading it off the page is harder to discern. And I think one of the reasons why Yeats reads aloud so marvellously is that he composed aloud. He composed by beating out a rhythm with his arm. There's famous descriptions of him walking around humming like a bee, as his wife said, as he composed out loud. The rhythms, the stresses are very powerful, even in difficult and complex poems like Sailing to Byzantium, which will be read by Sebastian Barry. It's a matter of rhythm, stress, and the extraordinary language which he employs. I think the poems gain greatly from being read out loud, not in a necessarily very performative or over-performative way, but in a way that does justice to their subtlety and their force.
Beautiful, Lofty Things, an evening with W.B. Yeats, is on at the National Concert Hall in Dublin this Saturday at 8 p.m. For more information, go to nch.ie.